to date, we've had more than 30 We Stand Against Hate events here at Brooklyn College, and we are especially pleased about today's event. We are honored to have with us Rabbi Michael Lerner. He is the editor of Tikkun magazine. Rabbi Lerner was actively involved in the anti-war movement. Today, Rabbi Lerner will discuss the psychopathology in American life that creates a climate in which racism and anti-Semitism can fester, and also strategies to take this country in a different direction. We are deeply honored to have Rabbi Lerner here with us today. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm very honored to be here with you today. I want to start by saying you can't understand what's going on right now in American politics or in global politics without understanding a struggle that has been going on for the past 10,000 years in human history. And it's a struggle about the nature of what it is to be a human being. And there are two contending worldviews that have been around for ever since class societies and patriarchy emerged. So here are the two. The first view about what it is to be a human being says this: each of us gets thrown into this world by ourselves, and we find ourselves surrounded by people who are primarily self-interested, and they are interested in advancing their interests and will seek to dominate people in order to, and control other people in order to maximize their own advantage. In such a world, your task, if you want to thrive, survive in this world, you've got to learn those same techniques and learn ways to dominate and control others, or else be sure that you're going to be dominated and controlled. And so it's up to you which of those two paths you want to go, but the rational person on this theory is a person who is learning the strategies of domination and control and then using them effectively for their own self-interest. And communities on this view are communities that come together to mutually support each other to dominate and control other people. And so out of this comes a politics. Homeland security is achievable through being successful in dominating and controlling others. In that worldview, by the way, there are differences about what the best strategy is for how to do that. In the contemporary America, for example, there are those who think that the primary way to succeed in that strategy is through military conquest or military power. And that's most of the Republican Party and a section of the Democratic Party. And then there are others who believe that the most successful way to do that is through economic penetration, cultural penetration, diplomatic power. But they are not differing. The two sides of inside this worldview do not differ on the goal. They only differ on what's the most effective means to achieve that goal of domination and control, advancing your own interest at the expense of others. So I call this the worldview of domination or power over. In the book, I call it the right hand of God, just because there's this psalm in the Bible that says, "Your right hand, God, your right hand is full of power." Psalm 118. And you've probably heard this point of view articulated in your life because almost everybody on the planet has heard it. It's a very widespread vision of how to achieve, how to lead a rational life. To lead a rational life, you learn the skills of domination, control, manipulation of others to advance your own interests, whether it be in your individual life or in your community's life. Now, contending as an alternative to that is a different worldview. And this worldview, which I call the left hand, not because of identifying with the left in politics, because sometimes there are people on the left who think that they can achieve their goal through domination and control also, or manipulation of others. But rather, this other view, this other worldview says, you know what? Most of the people that we know didn't really come into the world by themselves. They came into the world through a mother. Okay? There was somebody who birthed you, and in the first few years of your life, you survived because your mother or your mothering other, it could have been a man, it could have been a surrogate for somebody who took care of you. And we in psychology had sets of experiments that showed that actually when a baby is not picked up and cared for, that they died from failure to flourish, they used to call it. And in any event, you literally would not have survived without somebody giving you a certain amount of caring. A lot of people, when they hear this, will come up to me afterwards and say, Rabbi Lerner, you don't know my mother. and so I want to stipulate at the start that, anybody who has that feeling that I'll stipulate that your mother was as neurotic as you thought she was, but nevertheless gave you a good enough mothering to have made it possible for you to survive. And from that experience comes a different worldview. And that worldview says that the way to flourish in this world, the rational path for survival in this world, is a path that can come through caring for others, through generosity, through a loving attitude towards others. So, and that alternative worldview gave birth to a whole variety of religious traditions that had this as a part of its message to the world, that the world could be made safe if there was more love, if there was more caring, if there was more generosity. Now, in the struggles between these two worldviews over the course of the past 10,000 years, very often the power over worldview, since it was using force and violence, was able to make its case more effectively, let's say, or at least to win over many, many people, including many people in religious traditions, so that I know of no religious tradition, I could be wrong though, and maybe you'll tell me about it later. Actually, I'll take it back because I know Baha'i and whatever. But most religious traditions have both voices in it. So so that there really is no one religious tradition that is purely the left hand of God perspective, of the perspective of love, generosity, and caring, because over and over again, people have gotten despairing over that view and have been won over to the power over view, even inside of religions that ostensibly support the love and caring perspective, but actually many of its leaders, its priests, its rabbis, its ministers, its whatever you call them, who are in different religions, where the leaders end up, many of them siding with the right-hand world, the view of domination as a central part of their message. In any event, these two views are in constant struggle with each other, and the struggle is going on not just on some intellectual level, but inside almost every human being on the planet, because almost every one of us has both voices in our head. Both voices are there, and we are someplace at any given moment on a continuum between the voice of domination and the voice of love and generosity. Where we are at any given moment is partly a product of, well, how much loving did you get in that childhood? How quickly were you introduced into the world of domination? How much in your schooling was the world of domination given more credit than the world of love and caring? So most people have heard both of these worldviews. And one of the factors in where you are in the continuum at any given moment is how much loving you got as a child. Second factor is what kind of experiences you had as an adult. How often were you treated as a being who deserves love and caring, or how often did you have experiences that were manipulative, dominating, seeking their own goals at the expense of you, trying to get something from you. We're walking over here, and one of the women walking over here was saying, there isn't a woman on the planet, or certainly not in the United States, who hasn't experienced endless times what we're seeing with the show in Hollywood right now, of exploitation, of domination, of manipulation, of being touched without wanting to be touched, and so forth. So it's out there very much in people's experience that's happening. So how much of that has happened to lead people to then believe, well, this is just how it is. It's a world full of people who are seeking to get what they can for us without caring about who we are as human beings. A third factor is what worldviews we've been taught, because very often you get people are seeing over and over again in the media, the television shows, the sitcoms, etc. Often the sitcoms are about who is going to manipulate the other to get what they want. And it's often presented in a humorous way, but actually, whether they're after money, whether they're after sex, whatever they're after, and then it's presented in a humorous way, but the humor in part is because supposedly all the viewers realize, yeah, that's how the world is, and we're getting to see the real world, but it's being couched in a softer way, in a humorous way, but that's the reality of the world. Versus how much times did we hear worldviews presented that articulated the love, kindness, and generosity worldview. So that has another factor in where we are in this continuum at any given point. If you're religious, what part of the religion did you hear? Mostly the domination or mostly the love parts? And finally, there's the question of where is social energy moving? Because when social energy is moving more towards fear, then the voices in our head that say that this is the way the world is get dramatically reinforced. After 9/11, that was massively reinforced in the West. Now, this is not something that is just built into the structure of reality. It's a choice about how you view any reality. So let's take 9/11, because you'd think, well, wait a second, how else could we react? Well, imagine a different president than the one we had, going on television and saying the next day, yesterday we had several thousand people killed in our society, and it's a huge tragedy. And we need to focus our energy on the thousands and thousands of people who are willing to sacrifice their life to care for other people, and tens of thousands of people who came out to assist and try to in some way participate in saving people. And all around the world, millions, hundreds of millions of people sending us remarks of caring and support and like that. So I want you to know, my fellow Americans, that we're not going to give a victory to the terrorists by saying that the world is like them, because it's not like them. It's actually like the people who made all those sacrifices and the people who stood up against it. A different message, right? A very different kind of message that would have reinforced a different kind of worldview. You see what I'm talking about? Anybody see? So this is so everybody is on this, and where the social energy moves. Well, the social energy moved more towards hope in the mid part of the first decade, and people decided, okay, we're going to go with Obama for president. And then when Obama failed to come through with many of the things that he had promised or the hopes that he had raised, energy started to move it back in the opposite direction, more towards fear again. So part of where we are at any given moment is influenced by where social energy is moving as well. So this is one factor that you have to take into account whenever you're thinking about politics. Whenever you hear anybody give a talk, any college professor giving a lecture, any television show you see, any movie you see, any novel you read, any novelistic movie or a sitcom or whatever, always ask yourself, will this professor, will this talk, will this movie, will this book does it move people more towards fear or more towards hope? More towards believing in domination or more towards believing in the possibility of a different kind of world, a world of love and generosity? So this is an important framework that, if you take nothing away from what I'm saying, use this to assess what's going on in politics, and not just in politics, because every aspect of life has this dynamic in it. Use this framework. Okay, now the second thing I want to say is that I was an activist, social change activist in the 60s, and have been pretty much so ever since. And at a certain point, I decided I needed to understand the psychodynamics of American society. And so got a PhD in clinical psychology, and then did a study financed by the National Institute of Mental Health, although I don't think they knew exactly what they were financing. But I did the part that I said I was going to do for them, but I did a lot more. And over the course of 10 years of work in the Institute for Labor and Mental Health, which is the organization that I continue to be the executive director of, we interviewed and had groups of people that went on for several weeks, 10 weeks usually, learning about the psychodynamics in their lives of middle-income working people. And a particular focus that I was concerned about was trying to understand why people were moving to the right when their economic interests were with the left. And what I learned was the following. We learned about the lives of people in this, in middle-income working people and their experience. And here's what they told us. This was, by the way, a study that eventually included thousands and thousands of middle-income working people. That every day they go into a world of work in which they find themselves surrounded by others who are looking out for themselves and seeking to advance themselves in the world of work. And to do that, they have to convince those who have power in that world of work that they can contribute to the bottom line of money and power in that institution. And either directly or indirectly, that their work group will eventually contribute in such a way as to maximize their financial success. 90% of people work in those kinds of institutions. About 10% work in the nonprofit sector, and those in the nonprofit sector, it's not so much money, it's the ego of the people in the top usually. But for the rest, it is a lot about contributing to the the bottom line of money and power. And they find themselves either in their immediately in the people they work with, or at least in the competition between work groups. They find themselves in a situation in which they see that most people there are not there to help them advance. They're there to advance themselves. So all day long, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, they are absorbing the ethos of the world of work. And that ethos of the world of work is look out for number one, maximize your own advantage, and get ahead. And if you don't do that, you may lose your job. In fact, you often will lose your job. But if you don't lose your job, you certainly won't advance in this workplace, and you won't get more opportunities to use your intellectual capacities or any of the capacities that you have. You'll have to stick with a job, the lower level jobs that give you less opportunity to be fully yourself. Coming home from this, we learned something very interesting, that most people who are in these workplaces come out of them hating that this is the world, hating that this is what they have to do all day, and yet at the same time believing that it is totally impossible to change it, because it seems as though everyone else is acting in the same way, and that this hence constitutes reality. And so they have this conflicted feeling. On the one hand, okay, I need a job, I need this work, etc. And on the other hand, I really don't like what this is all about. And and yet at the same time, they also think, and yet everybody's like this. Everybody's out for themselves. And so unconsciously often, but through the group process that we were doing, it became more conscious for people. They would tell us about the ways in which they themselves started to embody in the rest of their lives the ethos of the world of work. Most people from the ages of 20 to 65 spend most of their waking hours in the world of the work. And so the dynamics in that are not surprisingly brought home into personal life. And they are dramatically reinforced by the media, the sitcoms, etc., that they watch, that seem to reinforce the notion that everybody is like that, and that that's what everybody wants. And that so much so that often they'll feel that there's something wrong with them if they feel uncomfortable with that reality. And so the parts of them that actually yearn for a different kind of world, for a world of love, for caring, for generosity, in other words, for this left-hand view of the world, starts to feel like not only that it's unrealistic, but that it's problematic, and maybe they better not share it with anybody else, because other people will think they're crazy, or at least that they are so unhappy with their lives that there's something really wrong with them. And so most people learn to not even talk about this. Instead, to put on an external facade of, oh yeah, things are great, I'm doing fine, etc. And rarely do they talk about the pain that they're in this situation, and the frustration that they're in. Or eventually they're able to block it out of their mind and just feel the pain and frustration, but not really connect it with what they've been doing all day. And they use various things, drugs, alcohol, other forms of addictions, television, Facebook today, other forms of addiction that keep them from being in touch with their own feelings about this. And this inevitably corrodes loving relationships as well, because as people increasingly bring the ethos of the marketplace into the rest of their lives, they see other people through that framework of what's in it for me. And so increasingly, and this is more each generation that is more influenced by the dominant culture is more and more and more powerful, the more you're likely to hear this, that people are saying, look, I'm entering a relationship, I get married because this person will take care of more of my needs than anybody else that is likely to fall for me in the short run. But that has the consequence of making marriages very unsteady. It used to be that people entered marriages and thought, okay, this is resolved now, I've got a partner for life. But if you enter into marriages with the consciousness of the marketplace, who's going to satisfy more of my needs, then very often what you find is, well, we had someplace between 40 and 50% of marriages ending up in divorce. And most people, even those that don't end in divorce, feel very insecure even in their marriages. Why? Because they can't be sure that at some point their partner wouldn't find somebody else whom they believe, rightly or wrongly, would satisfy more of their needs. And if that such person exists, then it's the rational thing to do. If you're a rational maximizer of self-interest, which is what you're supposed to be doing, what you should have learned all day in the world of work, if you're a rational maximizer of self-interest, you leave that relationship for another one. Again, do you see what I'm saying? Now, I am not putting down anybody who's been divorced. I've been divorced, okay? I'm not putting down anybody who's been divorced or who has made this choice. I'm saying that it's almost impossible in this society to to be in another way, to not have already internalized the looking out for number one attitude of the world. Then to act accordingly, and weakening loving relationships. Now, I say it's almost impossible, but it's not impossible, because there is another way of looking at the world and looking at other human beings. And that's what we call a spiritual consciousness. The spiritual consciousness goes like this. I see you as being created in the image of God, or if you don't believe in God, as being a sacred being, as somebody who is valuable just because of who you are as a human being, and not because of what you can deliver to me, what you can give to me. And but that consciousness, that spiritual consciousness, is hard to come by, and there's only one place where it's really articulated very strongly, and that is in the churches, the synagogues, the mosques, or the zendos, the religious world. It's the only place that is an institution that is set up to articulate and to say, you are valuable just because you are a human being, and not because of what you can do for us, but just because of who you are. And hence, many of these people that we were interviewing were telling of going to churches, and primarily right-wing churches, where they were hearing that message, even though there were lots of other messages that weren't so great. Why? Because in that place, they were being given validation for who they are. Now, I want to add on another level of what was so important about this validation of who you are. And that is that not only are people facing difficulties in seeing friendship relationships being so much about exchange, I get something from you, rather than solidarity, caring for the other. Marriages ending up in divorce. Insecurity all over the place. But they also have internalized another critical element of the ideology of the society. And here I step back for a second to give yet another dimension. Sorry to have to make a complex argument, but anyway, this is... So the next element is, you know that this is a society with vast economic inequality, that the top 1%, certainly the top 10%, owns more wealth than the other 90% of the population. That there's vast economic inequality in this society. How do the top earners, the top wealthy people, get away with this when there's democratic means available to transform that? The answer is that they have succeeded in the past several hundred years of convincing everybody that you live in a meritocracy. Meritocracy means that the society is built in such a way that those who make it because they have merit. They've worked harder, they're smarter, and because they have worked harder and smarter, that's why they have the more money. And the converse of that is, and if you didn't make it, it's because you did something wrong, or you are something wrong. Okay, you are something wrong, or you did something wrong. You failed in some way. And so you have nobody to blame but yourself. Now, this message is not just given; it's given even starting from your parents. Most parents and their parents before them, and so forth. This is the central self-justificatory, the self-justification of a class society, of the contemporary, the capitalist class societies. Because in earlier periods, they just said, look, you're born into this, and you're stuck in it, and there's no movement. But in capitalist societies, this is the primary self-justification of the society. You deserve you've created your own reality, and you deserve it. And this is massively reinforced. Your parents are saying to you, hey, you know what, if you study hard and you work hard, you can really succeed in this world. The society is based on merit, and they may not use that word, but they're saying, study hard, work hard, pay attention, suck up to the teachers if you have to, whatever you have to do, because you can make it. But the truth of the matter is that there is very little class mobility. Not no class mobility, there is some, but very, very little class mobility in the society. So why aren't people rebelling against it? Because instead, they're rebelling against themselves. They're telling themselves the story the meritocratic story that they've heard since they were 2 or 3 years old of, hey, you can be incredible, you can be anybody, you can be very successful in society. And hey, look, even Obama became president, so don't think that racism is a factor. You know, any place, you can get any place in this society if you work hard and you... This story is deeply internalized by everyone. We found that virtually everyone in our study, and not just people in bad jobs, but even people in relatively good jobs who nevertheless were saying, yeah, but if I had really been this, that, or the other thing, I would have had an even better job, or I'd have even more money, or I'd have even more success, etc. The self-blaming is so deep in the consciousness, and it's reinforced by various forms of pop spirituality and pop psychology, which say to you, hey, you make your own reality. Well, if you make your own reality, the flip side of that is, then if your reality isn't so good, you've got nobody to blame but yourself. In other words, it eliminates any sense of what the actual restraints are that you're facing and the actual forms of social organization that keep you in your place. So when people are in the situation where they're frustrated and unhappy, they often feel terrible and blame themselves. Now here comes the right wing, and this is the terrible part of the story that's very complicated to get. The right wing comes forward and says, you are not to blame. You are not to blame for the pain in your life. And the reason you're not to blame is, and then they fill in whoever are the demeaned others of the society in whatever society you're in. In Western societies, in Europe, it was the Jews who were primarily to be blamed. They had introduced selfishness and materialism. They're the ones who are looking out just for themselves. If you find yourself surrounded by selfishness, materialism, and you're feeling like nobody really cares about you, blame the Jews. In the United States, well, it started out with Native Americans and African Americans, and particularly African Americans, it has persisted over hundreds of years of saying, they're the ones to blame. They're the evil people. But in the past 30 to 40 years, it has extended as the contradictions in life have been more intense. It has extended to saying it's women who are feminist women who are looking to change, overcome patriarchy. They're only caring about themselves. They don't care about anybody else. So they're the ones who are introducing selfishness into the society. Or gays and lesbians. Now, why gays and lesbians? Well, they're not raising the next generation. By the way, not true. Many gays and lesbians are raising the next generation. But anyway, they're saying, because they're not raising the next generation, so they're just looking out for themselves. Then added on in the last 10, 15 years, it's been Muslims coming to this country. And it has been undocumented workers or refugees of various sorts. And you can name others, right? I've probably forgotten. Somebody will get up and say, "Why didn't you mention?" Okay, it's it's an expandable list of people. Now, and so I'm saying here's the terrible thing about this. It actually does reduce self-blaming. It makes people feel better about themselves to not have to blame themselves and to put the blame onto some other. And this is core to the success of racism, sexism, homophobia, etc. Now, don't get me wrong. There are many other strands to racism, sexism, and homophobia, and all the other xenophobia, anti-Semitism, etc., that are there. But this is an important element, okay? This is an important element in why they stick, why they continue to have attraction. It's because actually it feels good to be relieved of self-blame. Now, you might say, wait a second, if that's true, why isn't the liberal and progressive forces in there saying, hey, you know what, this spiritual crisis that you're talking about, there's another way to deal with it. We need to change the society in various ways, and it's not really the fault of African Americans and blacks and Native Americans and gays and lesbians and feminists and etc. Why isn't the left there saying there's another set of explanations for why you're feeling the way you're feeling, and shouldn't be feeling that. You don't have to feel that because this meritocracy is not true, and you are not to blame for being in the situation you're in. And the answer is because the liberal and progressive forces, by and large, do not have a clue about the spiritual crisis in the society. They don't even believe it. Instead, what they say is, you see, they take the rights blaming, and they say, oh no, the spiritual crisis isn't real. That's just code word for the racism, sexism, homophobia, xenophobia, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, etc. So here's this huge error, because those groups that are being attacked are being attacked not because people have a natural instinct to attack them, but because they have been helped on that path. At least a major part of helping them on that path has been the way in which it has been presented to them by the right. And so there's a real problem in the society with a phony solution. But if you don't understand the real problem, namely that people have learned to look at other human beings primarily from the standpoint of what they can get from them, and that is intrinsic to the capitalist market, and that they then end up blaming themselves for not being more successful. Instead, if you don't see that that's the critical spiritual crisis that people are in, that then is potentially manipulatable, then you think that the right solution is actually the problem. It is a problem. It's a big problem. But to undermine that problem, you need to understand how people get there. Now, let me repeat that I'm not in any way claiming that racism, sexism, homophobia, etc., are purely a product of this. On the contrary, there has been a long tradition of sexism and homophobia and anti-Semitism and Islamophobia that go through. And I can, if we had a few days, I could go trace the whole history of those realities. So they are part of the cultural inheritance, to be sure. But where they get the power to suddenly override what's actually in people's self-interest, namely to unite with each other and work to change the social order in such a way that it would be fairer and everybody would achieve a higher level of success. That comes from the powerful way that the right is able to manipulate these feelings and make people feel better about themselves by blaming it on others, and the left's total failure to understand that this is rooted in a real problem and that needs to be addressed and needs to be changed. But to the extent that the left has been formed out of Marxist ideology, out of a materialist worldview, they don't understand that there is a spiritual crisis. They don't understand this need. In fact, they barely ever articulate that people actually would hunger for a world based on love and caring and kindness and generosity. Barely ever articulate it. So we started to talk about this in our groups, and people started to get it, and then they would go into and say, okay, well, so we're going to join the liberal and progressive movements, and they did. They went into liberal and progressive movements, but they came back to us not so long after and said, we can't be there. Why? Well, here are the reasons. Number one, we experienced there shaming and blaming, because the way that they're talking in those movements about white working class people or white working class men is a way that is put downish. They assume that because we weren't with them before, that everybody who's not with them must actually be a racist, a sexist, a homophobe. We were going in there just wanting to see what the culture was like and see if we could fit in some way. But they talk about all the people that I work with in my workplace, in the factory I work in the hospital that I work in, and wherever that people were working, in the hotel workers and people who drive the buses. I mean, we were talking about the working class, right? That we were dealing with. It's that we can't fit in there because they have contempt for us. They talk down to us. I mean, that trend was dramatically reinforced by Hillary Clinton's statement that everybody who's for, half of Trump voters are a bundle of deplorables, right, deplorables. But that feeling was conveyed to them. That the second part of that gets conveyed to them had to do with the religiophobia. Because it turns out that in much of the liberal and progressive world, the message that they got, and they were telling us to us, that they got when they were there was that if you're into religion, and I'm saying many of these people, 60% of Americans still say that they go to church once a month. Now, I don't know if that's true that they actually go to church once a month, but I do know that that 60% still feel that they want to say that. Okay, they want that impression because they believe there's something about that institution that is right to identify with. Okay, so they're saying, hey, here's the experience. I go there and they tell me, they give me the message that they want me to be in their demonstrations. They want me to vote for their candidates. But basically they think that anybody who is religious or spiritual must be on a lower level of intellectual or psychological development. On psychological development, maybe they're religious because they need a father figure. It never worked out for them as a kid, so that's why they're into religion. Or on the intellectual level, well, they just aren't that smart. They're pretty stupid to believe this ridiculous stuff. But if you hang out with us long enough, you'll evolve to our higher level. And where you don't believe in any of that religious crap, and you've overcome your psychological defects, and you'll be with us, and you're welcome because we want you to evolve to our level. So this elitist message is one that makes people feel, no, I can't be there. It's not now. Now then, there's a third thing, and that is, so we said, well, what about the programs that the liberal and progressive forces support? And they said, a lot of them we agree with. And you can see this even in Trump's America today. You see when there are polls made about specific policy suggestions that are being put forward by the right, the majority of Americans don't support them. So then why are they voting in a different way? Why can't you support the liberal and progressive forces? And the answer that we got over and over again was, because they really hate us. And in other words, I can't get myself to support people who really think that I'm less than them, that think that I'm no good, that think that I'm stupid, and there's a lot of that goes on in the liberal and progressive world. That message is floating around. I don't mean that everybody has it explicitly, although you'd be amazed at how many people who are liberal and progressive have it in the back of their mind that, hey, these people really, if they were smarter, they would have been more successful in their lives, because they too have bought something about their own situation. They've drunk the Kool-Aid. They've believed in the meritocracy, but that feeling. I was going around giving talks around this issue. Some woman raises her hand at a bookstore event where I'm talking about this, and she says, yeah, you know what, this just happened to me this weekend. There's this guy I was interested in, and he finally calls me up and says, can we go out to breakfast this Sunday morning? And she says, I'd love to go out with you, but I go to church Sunday morning. Could we do it some other time? And he says, church? I thought you were liberal. So in other words, it's so deep in the culture of the liberal and progressive world that people are pushed away. So if you want to really deal with the power of hate movements, you've got to change the liberal and progressive world so that they stop being haters also, so that they stop being having an elitist consciousness, so that they, I should say we, because I'm part of that world, okay, so that we stop having an elitist consciousness. And there's one other factor that's very important, and that's this, that the liberal and progressive world knows what it is against, and it is really good at telling all the things that are wrong with the society, but it has very rarely articulated a vision of the world that that we are for. And I say this, Martin Luther King Jr. did not become an icon of social change by giving a speech that said, "I have a complaint." No, it was a dream of a different kind of world. And that was part of why I and others started the Tikkun magazine and then the Network of Spiritual Progressives. This is the organization that Tikkun magazine has created. Network of Spiritual Progressives. And one of the things that we do in this Network of Spiritual Progressives is articulate a vision of the world we want. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that, and then I'm pretty much going to get out of here, at least hope we have time for some discussion. Is it possible? So our central message is this: we need a new bottom line. America needs a new bottom line. In fact, the world needs a new bottom line. Instead of judging every institution, corporation, government policy, our education system, our judicial system, whatever system you're talking about, as efficient, rational, and productive, to the extent that it maximizes money or power for somebody. Instead, judge it efficient, rational, and productive to the extent that it maximizes love and caring, kindness and generosity, ethical and ecological sensitivity, caring for each other and caring for the earth, enhances our capacity to respond to other human beings as embodiments of the sacred, and enhances our capacity to look at the earth not as a resource for us to use as much as we want, but rather as something that intrinsically deserves to be cared for as a fundament and to stand in awe and wonder of. That's a very different bottom line. And if we had that bottom line, every institution, virtually every institution we have today, would look irrational and ineffective and inefficient and not productive. Okay, so now why is the old bottom line the bottom line? Well, it's not because they did research and found out that that's what people really want. It turns out that's not true. That actually, most people would prefer to live in a world of love and caring and kindness and generosity. Only, they think it's impossible. And I'll get back to that in a second. I want to tell you two manifestations of this vision of a new bottom line. So here are two concrete programs. Let's apply this principle to foreign policy. Okay, then what's our foreign policy? Right now, our foreign policy is right hand of God. Master power over, domination and control as the path to homeland security. We say, on the contrary, the path to homeland security is when the United States becomes the most famous as the most generous and caring country in the world. When we are perceived around the world as the most generous and caring country, we will be far more successful and far more safe than if we have another Iraq war or another Afghanistan war or, God forbid, a nuclear war with Korea or with Iran. That will not provide us with security. It will only provide us with more people who hate us and who are ready to give their lives to kill us. You want a path to security? The path to security is through caring and generosity for other people. What would that look like? Well, we've developed a global Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was a plan that was instituted after the Second World War to help Europe get back on its feet by giving aid to building up democratic institutions in those societies. A global Marshall Plan, we lay it out in our website, tikkun.org/GMP, if you want to read it. And so the global Marshall Plan, an endorsement of the Global Marshall Plan was introduced into Congress this past February by Representative Keith Ellison. Keith Ellison is the candidate the congressman from Minneapolis who almost became the chair of the Democratic National Committee. He came within 20 votes of being the new national chair of the Democratic National Committee. That's been introduced into Congress. He's been working with the Network of Spiritual Progressives. A second manifestation of this new bottom line is what we call the ESRA, the Environmental and Social Responsibility Amendment to the Constitution. It has the following parts. Number one, point number one of the ESRA is that it requires that no money be allowed in politics except that money which is allocated by state legislatures or the Congress equally to all major parties, to all major candidates. And all other money from corporations, from nonprofits, from individuals, eliminated, which means that your Congress people no longer have to spend their time courting the rich, convincing the rich, etc., that they will serve their interests in order to get enough money to run the next campaign. The second part of the environmental and social responsibility is this. It's based on the following understanding. You can't get a democratic society as long as corporations, even if they can't dominate with money, nevertheless have huge power because they can always threaten any given congressional district with the following. You know what? If you are going to make us less successful in accumulating as much money as we want, we'll simply move out of your district or out of your state, or if necessary, we'll move to Taiwan or we'll move to some other country. You see, it's a global market. We don't need to be here. So in relationship to that, most localities, most elected officials capitulate because they don't want to be responsible for the unemployment that they're causing. Okay, that's the background to point number two. So point number two is this. Every corporation with incomes above $50 million a year, so here we're not talking about mom and pop corporations, we're not talking about smaller corporations, we're talking about the big corporations that rule the world. Every corporation with incomes above $50 million a year must get a new corporate charter once every 5 years. And that new corporate charter will only be granted to those corporations that can prove a satisfactory environmental and social history of environmental responsibility. Okay, so to a jury of ordinary citizens who get to hear testimony from people all over the world who have been affected by that corporation. In other words, the corporation can't just say, fine, we've been great for the United States, we're dumping all our environmental toxins into Namibia or into South Korea or into wherever, to other places. No, because those who are in the Environmental and Social Responsibility Amendment juries will hear testimony from people all over the world. And that gives an incentive to people in the corporations. See, most people in corporations are not evil people. They're not the bad guys. Mostly, they're in a system in which they have a responsibility to their investors to maximize their investment. So what we're saying to them is, fine, you can't maximize you can't fulfill your responsibility to your investors if you aren't environmentally and socially responsible in such a clear way that you can convince a jury that you've been that in the past 5 years. And the third part is mandatory in every school from kindergarten through graduate school, each year a course on appropriate to that grade level on the environment and the environmental crisis, so that everybody learns what's going on in the environment and it becomes central to what education is about. So that's the ESRA. Okay, so here you've heard it, the new bottom line, Global Marshall Plan, ESRA, and of course the response that you're likely to have is this guy serious? I mean, does he really think this is possible? This is so unrealistic. And so I want to step back from that for a second and say, yes, it is unrealistic from the standpoint of those who define what realistic is, namely those who are in the corporations, those who are in the media, and those who are your elected political representatives, including very many good guy people, good women, good men in elected office who are thinking in terms of, well, given the way power is configured at this moment, this can't ever happen, so there's no point in even thinking about it. But the truth is that every fundamental change that's ever happened in this society has happened because people were willing to stand up for something that they believed in that was totally unrealistic at the time. So when slavery was, when the debate about slavery was taking place, people were saying we want to eliminate slavery. It was very unrealistic for those people who were in the anti-slavery movement for the first 20 or 30 years. Everybody around them was saying, you're crazy, it'll never happen. Similarly, ending segregation. Most of the people, even other religious leaders around Martin Luther King Jr. were saying, this is very unrealistic. You'll never stop segregation. So stop giving these fiery sermons and encouraging people to go out in the streets and fight against segregation. It's totally unrealistic. It'll never happen. Similarly, ending apartheid in South Africa. Similarly, gays and lesbians getting the right to marry. In each case, when people started to articulate these ideas, most of their, not just enemies, most of their friends were telling them, it's unrealistic, don't go for it. So what I want to say to you about all of this is, you want to end hate in this society? Don't be realistic. Don't be realistic. Don't waste your time on this planet, how much time it is. For young people, maybe another 70 years of your life. Don't waste your time on this planet fighting for what people tell you is realistic. Instead, go for your highest vision of the good, whatever that vision is. I'm saying that vision could be, and I invite you to join our network of spiritual progressives, and you'll find it on the web, spiritualprogressives.org. Anybody in this room who wants to join, there's a fee to join. It's a sliding fee scale, but if it's too much, all you have to do is write to me and say, I want to join. I want to be part of your movement. And you can join for free. But money is not our bottom line. We have no money. So how could it be our bottom line? We have no money. So money is not our bottom line. Our bottom line is solidarity. I want to invite you to join, to read Tikkun magazine. Same thing. My email is rabbilerner.tikkun, Tikkun, @gmail.com. And you can get it from me later if you want. That's my private email. Just write me and say, hey, I heard you speak at Brooklyn College, and I want to join, or I want to get a subscription to Tikkun, and I don't have enough money to pay for it. Fine. As I say, be part of it. And if not part of us, then a part of some movement. Don't be realistic. Go for your highest vision of the good. Because it's only when because you never, in terms of what is realistic, you actually never know what is realistic until you have spent years and years fighting for what is desirable, for what you really believe in. And it turns out that so much of the advances that have made in human history, and certainly in the past 50 years, have happened because people went for what was unrealistic and put their life energies into it. I invite you to do the same thing. And I believe that in doing that, you will make a major contribution to ending hate on this planet. Thanks.
Can you take some questions?
Absolutely.
Hi. The first question is hate universally bad? I can understand a distinction between hate versus an individual as being bad, but hate against ignorance of client science or hate against falsehoods seems to be valid. I just want your comment about hate in general.
Mm-hmm. Well, hate is an emotion. And as an emotion, it's not one that actually brings out the best in people. So to say, I want to use my life energies to oppose X, Y, or Z, that's not necessarily hate, okay? I'm totally in support of those who are, and I have been involved in those movements to struggle against racism, against sexism, against homophobia, against Islamophobia, against anti-Semitism, and so forth. That's a good thing to do. But what I want to say to you is that it's important to separate the idea and the policies that you oppose from invalidating the humanity of the people who hold those ideas. And one of the terrible mistakes of the liberal and progressive world has been to conflate those two, so that we end up demonizing people who have ideas that are really ones that we want to struggle against. And I think we need to stop doing that. So one of the things that I should have mentioned in the feedback that people were giving from these from working class people going into liberal and progressive movements was, hey, they're saying that I'm because I'm white or because I'm male, I'm the enemy, and honestly, it wasn't my fault. that I'm white or that I'm male. That's how I was born. And they claim that they're against racism and sexism, etc., but that they shouldn't judge people by the color of their skin or by their biology, but they're judging me by that. They're saying that they've gone from the correct position of we want to struggle against the culture of patriarchy, the culture of male supremacy, the culture of white supremacy. We want to fight against that culture, but we don't want to identify that culture with everybody who happens to be white or everybody who happens to be male. Because when we do that, what they were saying to us is, I feel like they hate me from the start. So why should I give them any support when they hate me from the start just because I am a male or because I am white? It's a crazy strategy to pursue. So we need to separate out opposition, strong, powerful opposition to positions and policies that we oppose on the one hand to the people who articulate them, and instead we need to see that many of those people actually have the same desire for a world of love and caring as you do, but for a variety of reasons, which I've tried to explain some of today, they don't connect that to their racism or sexism or homophobia. A lot of those people can be won back, but they will be won back through love and caring about them, not through us hating them because they have views that we think are detestable.
Thank you.
And I don't understand at all why you said that Martin Luther King, by saying, I have a dream, he didn't say, I have a complaint. But you are asking us to be not realistic, unrealistic. But I understand Martin Luther King, I have a dream, as an utopia. And if we analyze the discourse of Martin Luther King, we will find out that he was complaining about most of the things that you describe as materialistic and so forth. So I don't understand at all the difference between I have a dream and not dream did not incorporate complaints. So it was not so clear for me. Thank you.
Well, the first thing I want to say is that in no way am I suggesting that everybody should become religious. Okay, I'm not. I am suggesting that what the religious world has is something that is very badly needed. And our network of spiritual progressives, we always say, is interfaith and secular humanist and atheist welcoming. Okay? Because we don't believe that you have to be religious in order to share these values. On the contrary, we think that every human being actually yearns for a world of love and caring and kindness and generosity. And our task is to help get out of the way, to scrape out of the way all the things that make them feel that it's impossible and that they'll never go for it. Because we together constitute the vast majority of the human race who could recreate this planet in a year, in 5 years, in 10 years. We could do it if everybody who went for that part of themselves that is there, but that they think they're the only ones who feel that way, or only the people in their particular little group feels that way, and everybody else is just out for themselves, and that there's no point in it, and it's totally fantasy and so forth. It's the circulating one to another of the belief that, oh, that's so, it's so sweet, but totally impossible, so let's forget it. Okay? That's what keeps it in place. And so, yes, there's no reason to say that you have to be religious to do that. On the other hand, the thing about religion is it's the only existing institution that allegedly claims to be for that. Okay? Allegedly, I say, because the right hand of God consciousness has spread into religion also. In many places, they don't actually believe that anymore. They don't believe what they're saying, and so you don't get the feel that they're really into it. But if you've been to some of the right-wing churches, as I have been, you find that an awful lot of people are doing an awful lot of loving and caring to each other. And it's something to see, because I know I'll say in the Jewish world, when I go to a reform or a conservative or even my own denomination or whatever we call it, the movement, the Jewish renewal movement, we have great things to say, but you hear great sermons and so forth. Afterwards, everybody goes home. When I go to an Orthodox synagogue, I hear things that I can't stand being said from the pulpit. Blind support for Israeli policy that I think is oppressive and violation of the highest values of the Jewish people, but that Israel is doing right now, that I strongly disagree with. But then afterwards, people come up to me and say, do you have a place for lunch? Is there anybody in your family who's in the hospital or needs a visit? When I was single, they'd say, would you like to meet a woman? These little things that are felt like somebody's actually caring about me here. When I go to political meetings in the liberal or progressive world, I never feel like anybody's caring about me, right? I feel like they'll listen to your idea. Maybe you can even win over somebody for a vote, but nobody feels like their charge in that movement, their responsibility in that movement is to care for each other, okay? Caring for each other, love, put that on the front burner. And then, no, you don't have to be religious to do that. You don't have to believe in God to do that. But start doing it. That's why we're building a network of spiritual progressives. So I hope that would be the feeling that you could get if you go to a network of spiritual progressives meeting in New York. I hope that people could feel that after that meeting that people are saying to each other, is there some way I can be of help to you? Is there some way that I can be of service to you? You can do that. You can make that happen. So you don't have to be religious to do it, but it's important. Now, in terms of Martin Luther King Jr., what I was trying to say about the having a dream is that he was putting forward the notion that someday blacks and whites together will overcome. And that's a very different vision than the vision that I sometimes hear from people saying, no, it's just our group that we have to worry about, and not, we can't build over because there's too much racism. So blacks and whites can never work together. We need to be totally separate. So King was putting forward a politics and a political vision that said, let's articulate the world we want. You say it's utopian. I say no. Nothing like that is utopian. Maybe utopian to think you can fly with your arms only. But it's not utopian to believe that we could have a world that has a lot more love and kindness in it as the center of shaping the world, in which the bottom line of every institution was love, caring, kindness, generosity, ethical and environmental sensitivity. Well here, but why don't you?
I'm Deborah Capel. I'm a community member. I am going to disagree with you. I'm going to disagree with you.
Be my guest.
Okay. I'm very good at this. I see your point of looking at people as humans, as having a spiritual undercut, a spiritual look at people is a very, very important additive to anybody's activism. But the point is that it's money. That money is the cause of racism and poverty and homophobia, all the way back, and sexism. And although some of the people who are forced by corporate law to look for the highest amount of return, there are also people who work in the cigarette industry, the tobacco industry. These people know that they're pushing death, and they know that they're pushing death when they send all the cigarettes to the third world. So yes, I think love is important, but I think anger is really necessary.
Okay, I don't want to disagree with you that I want to be angry at their policies. I don't want to be angry at the people. That's why I was distinguishing. And I want to try and figure out a way to talk to them. And here's our difference. For me, money is, it's never been able to speak to me. I put it on the table, it doesn't argue with me. It's what we do with money is what screws things up. and it's our human choices. Okay, we could simply put the ESRA in place, and corporations would have a money incentive to be environmentally sensitive and not send stuff to the third world or end up losing their corporate charter. In other words, it's us human beings who could change that, and that's all I'm saying. Money is an inanimate object. We use it in a particular kind of way. We could change the way we use it if we were willing to together do that. So, yes.
I think that, do you want to take maybe one more question,
Sure.
Rabbi?
Yeah,
and then
some
we'll
people are
retire to the
voting.
penthouse. We can certainly continue the dialogue there.
But another woman, hopefully.
There's a woman over there, back there.
Hi, how are you? I just kind of wanted to come back to something that you said to the gentleman in the same row as me. You used this example of going to an Orthodox church and maybe not agreeing with everything that is said, but then being welcomed with all this kindness. And I think it's important to recognize that kindness and love and generosity comes in a selective nature. And I think if you walk into that kind of a setting and coming from that religion and that community, I think there's a certain likeness that offers that kindness to you. I don't think that someone of color walking into that same setting would receive the same kind of kindness that you saw in that setting. So I think that it's also interesting or important to note that this mindset of universal kindness has its avenues of exception. And unfortunately, that's the reality that we do live in. So, and I also was kind of turned off of the fact that like meeting a woman was an act of kindness, because that just like prophetizes women, and I didn't enjoy that either. But it's just kind of thinking about different scenarios, different types of people, and how people interact, and not grouping it so lovely and packaged the way it's being said, because that isn't the reality of what it really is.
You're also right. I mean, I'm not denying. I didn't mean to romanticize any of the institutions in our society and say they're pure, and there are distortions in every institution and in every human being, and there's a counter tendency, and I've seen it in right-wing churches. I've seen it in places where there are people who I really disagree with about their politics deeply, 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 and yet find parts of their humanity that are deep and real. And I want to affirm those parts. You know, I want to affirm the parts of conservatives you were saying last night, right? The parts of, I think it was you anyway, that the parts of conservatives that agree with progressives in a critique of the individualism and the materialism in this society. I don't want to write them all off as being evil people or something. They're not. There are many decent people who have ideas that I disagree with, and I want to be able to respect them and to approach everyone as though there is an element in them that is redeemable. And why do I think that? Well, first I did that by coming to find that in myself, okay? And then as a therapist, finding that in lots and lots and lots of people who I probably would not have chosen to hang out with. But to find that people can transform and change. And this is what it is to be a human being. Our nature as human beings is to be able to change our nature. So I hope I'm addressing some of what you said. And if not...
Just thinking about like the kindness that you receive as a white man in a space that you can feel and you can receive and you can apply to your work is not the kindness that people of color experience in white spaces. You know what I mean? Or in conservative spaces. So it's just thinking about like it's easier to manifest these ideals as a white man than it is to manifest them as people of color. and to just keep remembering to come back to that because it's a separate experience.
Totally right. And that's why it's so important to dismantle the racism and to dismantle white privilege. It's very, very important to do, but to do it in a way that succeeds. Because right now, the way the left has done it has been to push more and more people into the right, and to now put forward people in not just Trump, but in the Republican Congress, not just in the Congress. The majority of state houses, legislators around the country are dominated by people who would not be in office today if they didn't have a base of people who 8 years ago voted for Obama and have moved to the right after that. Okay, their racism wasn't so deep that they wouldn't vote for an African American. I'll tell you this: nobody in Germany in 1920s or 1930s would have voted for a Jew running for office. Okay, the racism there was a different sort of a so. But the racism is real here. But we have played some role in intensifying and empowering it by labeling everybody who is white or who is male as the enemy. And we've got to stop doing that. We've got to stop doing that. We've got to look for a way to win that section of people who have moved to the right back away from the right. And to do that, you have to start with affirming their humanity rather than affirming their evilness.
It's a good place to end. And one last time, thank you so much, Rabbi Michael Lerner, for your work.